I got to farm with my dad every day. It's a way of life. It's a wonderful way of life. And it's at risk, and it shouldn't be.
The impact of Trump's tariffs is being felt in the heartland.
Soybean farmers here are now suffering economically like they haven't in decades.
Right now, we are harvesting soybeans in Marengo, Illinois. My family has been farming since 1846. I'm the 5th generation. We're a grain operation. We grow corn.
With a population of over 1 billion people, Africa has become the continent with the highest investment opportunities. Investing in businesses that are both innovative and lucrative is key. Africa is a continent with a lot of resources, and investing in the right market sector using the best resources and the best strategies and taking advantage of the huge market will yield high return on investments. But there is a problem.
Have long struggled with high costs and low prices for their crops. But this year, there is even greater uncertainty in the fields. China stopped buying all U.S. soybeans in May, retaliation for President Trump's tariffs. Many American farmers were left without their largest export market. President Trump and China's President Xi Jinping came to a temporary
communities, using technology to turn the Sahara green.
The oasis, for me, masterpieces of survival.
Domestically manufacturing organic fertilizers.
We are aiming to increase farm productivity.
And building critical infrastructure to ensure harvests make it to the market.
We have been able to reduce that post-harvest losses from an average of 40% to less than 1%.
Africa is home to 60% of the world's uncultivated farmland. Its farming potential...
Aliko Dangote, Africa's richest man, recently invested $1 billion in rice farming. Africa imports billions of dollars worth of rice each year, and Dangote surely wants a piece of the action. You may not be aware that investors from the USA and Europe have purchased or leased millions of hectares of African farmland. Did you know that foreign direct investment in African agriculture reached $15 billion in 2010 and will be $65 billion by 2025?
This is a map that shows the impact of tariffs on farmers across the country. Hundreds of thousands of them work in industries that are impacted by tariffs. These are the states that voted for Trump, and you can see the overlap. China and Canada placed retaliatory tariffs focusing on the Midwest and the South, and that's intentional. This is meant to send a message to the president and apply pressure to Republicans who have to answer to their own constituents. Farming is an easy target because the United States exports more than 100 billion.
It takes a lot of hands to hand harvest fruits and vegetables.
Talk to any farmer and they'll tell you it's difficult work.
This is a 24-hour job. So I need people who are willing to work in shifts at different times of the day.
But it's hard to find those people.
Yeah.
American farms are on the decline. There was a 7% drop in farms from 2017 to 2022, according to the USDA. That's about 142,000 fewer farms in just...
Because of tariffs, we're doing unbelievable. We're making more money than we ever have made. And by the way, we're going to take some of that tariff money that we made, just to get off the subject for a second, we're going to take some of that tariff money that we made, we're going to give it to our farmers, who are, for a little while, going to be hurt until it kicks in. The tariffs kick into their benefit. So we're going to make sure that our farmers are in great shape, because we're taking in a lot of money. We're finding, the other day, it was very interesting, they found $31 billion. They said, sir, we found 31. I said, you mean positively, right? They said, yeah, 31 million more than we knew. And they said, we don't know where it came from. I said, check the tariff shelf. They came back the following morning. They said, you're right, sir, it came from the tariffs. We've never seen anything like this. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking some money from all of the tariff money that we've taken, and we're going to distribute it to our farmers until the tariffs kick into their benefit, which ultimately the farmers are going to be making a fortune. But it's a process of, it has to kick in.
We are really, really excited and very grateful to President Trump's leadership and being willing to be bold and fearless in facing some pretty big policy challenges around the world.
So what is the impact on farmers then?
Well, we'll see, right? I mean, we're negotiating. Now we move into some significant negotiations. I mean, I've got a great chart here.
It is critical for food security. Modernizing farming practices, improving access to technology, and strengthening support for smallholder farmers are key to unlocking this potential. China has become an important partner in this effort. Through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, both sides are working together to modernize agriculture, share technology, and build stronger farming systems.
To our farmers, have a lot of fun. I love you too. I love you too. It's all going to happen. New trade policy will also be great for the American farmer. I love the farmer. Who will now be selling into our home market, the USA, because nobody is going to be able to compete with you. Because there's goods that come in from other countries and companies, they're really in a bad position in so many different ways. They're uninspected. They may be very dirty and disgusting, and they come in and they pour in, and they hurt our American farmers. The tariffs will go on agricultural product coming into America, and our farmers, starting on April 2nd, it may be a little bit of an adjustment period. We had that before when I made the deal with China, $50 billion of purchases, and I said, just bear with me, and they did. They did. Probably have to bear with me again, and this will be even better. That was great. The problem with it was that Biden didn't enforce it. He didn't enforce it. $50 billion of purchases, and we were doing great, but Biden did not enforce it, and it hurt our farmers. But our farmers are going to have a field day right now. So to our farmers, have a lot of fun. I love you too. I love you too. It's all going to happen.
Africa's agricultural landscape was once described as underdeveloped, fragmented, and dependent on food imports from distant giants like the United States. But that description is now outdated, almost laughably so. Today, Africa is undergoing the biggest agricultural transformation in its modern history, a seismic shift driven not by aid but by investment, technology, and newfound political unity. At the center of this shift is an 80 billion mega-farming revolution, a coordinated push by African nations to industrialize food production, convert idle land into world-class farming hubs, and reclaim control over their own food supply. The consequences of this movement are being felt far beyond the continent's borders, especially in the United States, where farmers are watching their once guaranteed export markets shrink at record speed. The revolution began quietly: pilot projects in East Africa, land reform policies in Southern Africa, and public-private farming partnerships in West Africa. But what began as separate initiatives quickly merged into a continent-wide strategy. Governments launched ultra-modern agricultural zones spanning hundreds of thousands of hectares, complete with irrigation grids, energy facilities, farm mechanization centers, and rail lines that moved grain directly from fields to ports. These were not the smallholder farms the world had long associated with Africa. These were industrial-scale operations designed to compete with and ultimately surpass traditional agricultural powers. The catalyst for this transition was urgency. After decades of dependence on imported wheat, soybeans, and corn mostly from the United States, African leaders had finally decided, never again. Food insecurity had become a national security issue, and the solution was simple: produce at home what had been imported for generations. But instead of copying Western methods piece by piece, Africa leapfrogged. Drones replaced labor-intensive monitoring, artificial intelligence optimized planting, fertilizer use, and pest control. Solar-powered irrigation turned dry regions into breadbaskets. Instead of fighting the old battles of land versus labor, Africa re-engineered its entire strategy using data, sustainability, and scale. International investors rushed to get on board. Wealth funds from the Middle East, agritech companies from China, and manufacturing firms from India financed greenhouse clusters, precision irrigation systems, and fertilizer factories across the continent. Some African countries signed joint ventures to produce tractors locally. Others launched satellite-guided farming programs that allowed small farmers to participate in national supply chains without being left behind. The result was unprecedented. Africa, once called the future breadbasket of the world, was finally becoming one on its own terms. But this new agricultural empire came at a cost, mostly for the United States. For decades, U.S. farmers had relied on African markets as a reliable dumping ground for surplus grain and genetically modified soy. Trade agreements made Africa heavily dependent on U.S. agricultural imports. But now those same markets were closing. The first signs of trouble appeared when several African nations reduced U.S. wheat imports by more than half. Others canceled soybean contracts altogether. Within months, what had been a distant warning became an economic shock. Farmers across the American Midwest began sounding the alarm. Grain silos were full, prices were falling, contracts were evaporating. What made matters worse was the timing. American agriculture was already struggling with climate stress, foreign competition, and rising debt. Now it faced a competitor it had never truly considered. An Africa equipped with megafarms, modern technology, and trade alliances stretching from Beijing to Riyadh. Politicians tried to downplay the danger at first. Some dismissed Africa's agricultural boom as temporary hype, but that denial didn't last. When a major African trading bloc announced plans to begin exporting corn, wheat, and processed foods to Asia and the Middle East markets historically dominated by American agribusiness, the panic became real. Agricultural lobbyists flooded Washington, warning that the U.S. was losing control of global food influence. It wasn't just the crops that frightened American farmers, it was the model. Africa wasn't just exporting raw produce. It was exporting value-added goods. Flour mills, processing plants, grain storage systems, dairy factories, and packaging centers meant African farms were capturing every stage of the value chain. For the first time in history, African-made food products were showing up in foreign supermarkets as finished goods, not just raw materials. That was something U.S. producers never expected. Meanwhile, African nations began restricting raw food exports unless they were processed locally first. The message was bold: Africa will feed itself, then feed the world on its own terms. These policies didn't just strengthen local industries, they weakened the very structure that kept U.S. agribusiness dominant for decades. The shift was also cultural. Young Africans were entering agriculture not as subsistence farmers but as tech-enabled entrepreneurs. They ran solar-powered greenhouses, used sensors to manage soil data, and traded commodities through blockchain-powered platforms that eliminated middlemen. Suddenly, agriculture was not a relic of the past, it was the fastest-growing sector of the future. That reality stunned American agricultural analysts, who had long assumed Africa would forever remain dependent. Washington began to panic not just because Africa was rising but because America had no plan to replace what it was losing. U.S. farmers protested, demanding subsidies and emergency intervention. Officials promised new export strategies, but how does one compete with a continent that controls 60% of the world's uncultivated farmland and is finally using it strategically? The most symbolic shift came when a major African grain alliance announced it was creating its own agricultural stock exchange, one that would set prices independently instead of following Chicago's benchmarks. That single decision signaled the end of U.S. pricing dominance over global food markets. The $80 billion mega-farming revolution had done something unimaginable just a decade earlier. It turned Africa into an agricultural superpower and turned American farmers into the ones begging for market access. And this was only the beginning. Africa was no longer asking for a seat at the table. It was building its own table, and the world was realizing it might soon be forced to sit at it. The true shock within Washington came not from Africa producing more food analysts had predicted that would eventually happen, but from how fast the shift occurred and how deeply it disrupted the U.S. agricultural system. For nearly a century, the United States had enjoyed near total control over global grain flows. Even during economic downturns, one thing remained constant: the world bought American food. Now, for the first time in generations, that assumption had been shattered. African nations, once dependent on food aid and imports from Midwestern farms, were not just self-sufficient, they had become direct competitors in the global market. The United States had invested billions into agricultural influence abroad, using food exports as both diplomacy and leverage. Countries that relied on American grain often aligned their politics accordingly. But with Africa's new mega-farming revolution, that era was ending. When several major African economies announced they would no longer purchase subsidized U.S. grain, the American farm belt felt the blow immediately. Reports surfaced of soybean fields being left unharvested, corn futures collapsing, and farmers openly questioning whether their businesses could survive another season. What shocked U.S. policymakers most was that Africa had skipped the slow, conventional route of agricultural expansion. Instead of gradually scaling up, it vaulted into the future with high-tech mega-irrigation systems, drone surveillance, satellite mapping, and renewable energy-powered farming grids. While American farms struggled with aging equipment, rising fertilizer costs, and climate disruptions, African agricultural zones moved with precision, efficiency, and minimal waste. International media began describing the shift as the reverse of the Green Revolution. For decades, Western agricultural companies exported seeds, fertilizer, and technology to Africa, profiting while reinforcing dependency. Now the power dynamic had flipped. African agribusiness firms were expanding into Asia, the Middle East, and even Latin America, selling climate-resilient crops and automation systems. Some had even begun offering consulting services to Western farming groups, another humiliation for U.S. institutions once considered the global standard. In response to the crisis, U.S. lawmakers proposed emergency export subsidies and tariffs targeting African agricultural products, but those tactics only made things worse. African nations responded by forming a unified trade coalition to block certain U.S. agricultural imports, protect domestic markets, and negotiate deals collectively with global buyers. This level of coordination would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier, but the mega-farming revolution had changed everything agriculture was. No longer a national strategy but a continental one. Behind closed doors, American analysts admitted the deeper nightmare. The United States wasn't just losing sales, it was losing strategic leverage. Food had always been a geopolitical weapon. When Washington sanctioned a nation, famine was often an unspoken threat. But now, African countries, newly empowered by domestic production, were less vulnerable to such pressure. Some, in fact, were exporting grain to nations under U.S. sanctions, further undercutting Washington's influence. The U.S. was losing not only profits but power. The panic deepened when major African farming blocs formed long-term supply contracts with China, India, and Gulf states, markets traditionally dominated by the United States. China, in particular, celebrated the alliance. With Africa supplying grain, livestock feed, and agricultural commodities, China reduced its reliance on American imports, allowing it to negotiate from a position of strength. The U.S. farm lobby warned this could trigger the worst agricultural collapse since the Great Depression. The American public remained largely unaware of the crisis until supermarkets began adjusting prices. As domestic oversupply clashed with collapsing export markets, farmers struggled to stay afloat. Some sold equipment, some sold land, some left farming entirely. Meanwhile, African agriculture grew even more profitable. Investment funds announced record returns from African agribusiness ventures, and foreign investors shifted capital from California and Iowa to Zambia, Kenya, and Ghana. What happened next stunned even seasoned economists. Africa began exporting not just staple crops, but premium goods, organic grains, specialty oils, processed foods, and ready-to-eat packaged products sold under African brands. For decades, African crops were exported raw, processed in Europe or America, and sold back at a markup. Now African-owned processing plants kept that value on the continent. This wasn't simply agricultural growth, this was value chain dominance. The transformation also carried a symbolic power. African farmers once dismissed as subsistence laborers were suddenly speaking at global economic forums, leading international commodity councils, and setting prices on regional exchanges instead of waiting for price updates from Chicago and Kansas. The psychological shift was as profound as the economic one. While this agricultural renaissance fueled pride across Africa, it exposed the fragility of American farming. The United States had rested comfortably on its historic strength, failing to modernize at the pace required for a changing world. Climate disasters, financial strain, and political paralysis made it impossible for U.S. farming to compete with Africa's new highly coordinated, tech-driven production model. To cope, American agricultural corporations tried to buy into African farms, hoping to profit from the revolution rather than compete against it. But most African governments blocked such acquisitions, enforcing strong local ownership laws. They had learned from decades of foreign corporate extraction, and this time Africa was keeping control. With supply chains shifting and global trade maps being redrawn, it became clear this wasn't a temporary crisis, it was the new world order. Africa was no longer a passive participant in global agriculture, it had become the battlefield, where economic power was being redefined and the United States was losing ground fast. The worst part? This $80 billion mega-farming revolution was only in its first phase. Africa wasn't done, it was just getting started. The turning point came when African governments took the next step, processing their own produce. Crops that once left the continent raw and cheap were now being exported as packaged, branded, and high-value products. African-owned food companies began entering markets once dominated by American agribusiness, offering everything from organic cocoa butter to premium-grade rice to export-certified beef. The world started to notice that African products were not just cheaper, they were cleaner, fresher, and backed by local supply chains that did not collapse under global crises. As African trade blocs banned the export of unprocessed crops, the United States lost more than suppliers, it lost control over the pricing power it once held. At home, U.S. farmers began to feel a pain they never imagined. First came price drops as global buyers shifted away from American suppliers. Then came shortages in fertilizer, minerals, and crops once sourced from Africa, except now those same African producers were selling elsewhere for higher prices, giving priority to China, India, and regional markets. It was no longer possible to ignore the shift. The U.S. agricultural system had been built on the assumption that Africa would always remain the world's plantation, supplying cheap raw materials while America dominated exports and branding. That assumption no longer held, and without Africa's resources, U.S. agribusiness started collapsing from within. Think tanks in Washington began sounding the alarm. If Africa continued expanding agricultural sovereignty, the United States could lose as much as 40% of its export value in certain markets. The warning was clear: if America cannot control food, it cannot control global influence. Food had always been a weapon of power used to secure political deals, enforce trade sanctions, and maintain dependency. But now Africa was weaponizing its own harvest. The 80 billion African mega farming revolution was not just feeding the continent, it was provoking a global realignment of food security and trade. In Europe, panic quietly spread through parliaments and boardrooms. Major food companies that depended on African raw materials found themselves outbid by Asian buyers. African countries were forming direct contracts with supermarkets in France, Germany, Italy, and the UK, but on their own terms, at their own prices. No more cheap cocoa from West Africa. No more ultra-low-cost tea and coffee from East Africa. No more cotton without added value. Instead, they exported finished chocolate, packaged tea blends, and designer textiles, all made in Africa. For the first time in history, Europe was importing African brands instead of stripping the raw materials to manufacture their own. The United States tried to respond with pressure and incentives, offering new deals, aid packages, and special trade agreements, but the world had changed. Africa had learned a lesson from centuries of exploitation. Control the land and you control the future. Control the supply chain and you control the power. Washington's influence was no longer enough. Even major U.S. food giants had moved their manufacturing facilities from the Midwest to West Africa, where raw materials, labor, and markets were now cheaper and more stable. They didn't do it to support African growth, they did it to survive. Meanwhile, African farmers, once overlooked and underpaid, had become global actors. Agricultural universities, research centers, and AI-driven farming hubs flourished across the continent. New irrigation systems turned deserts into farmland. Drone-based crop monitoring replaced manual labor. Biotech startups developed drought-resistant seeds tailored to African climates. Every innovation widened the gap between American farms struggling with aging infrastructure and Africa's hypermodern production system. The most dramatic consequence was psychological. The world had always been conditioned to believe that Africa needed to be saved. Now it was the United States that appeared desperate, outdated, and unprepared. When global commentary began describing African agriculture as the new Middle East oil and the backbone of future food security, American analysts understood the magnitude of the shift. The narrative had flipped forever. A growing number of African nations began discussing a continental food reserve and a sovereign agricultural fund, something similar to oil-backed wealth funds, but powered by farming. If that fund became active, Africa would not only control its exports, but also dictate pricing and supply in a way the United States once did with corn, wheat, and soy. The threat was not just economic, it was symbolic. For the first time, Africa had leverage strong enough to reshape global power. The fury among U.S. farmers was not only about lost profits, it was about lost certainty. America had believed its agricultural supremacy was eternal. It had never prepared for a world where another region could outproduce, outprice, and outmaneuver it. But Africa had spent decades preparing for this moment. It had learned from famine, drought, and economic sabotage. It had learned to cooperate beyond borders, to think in terms of trade blocs instead of individual states. The $80 billion revolution was not a trend, it was a declaration. And as the continent continued to invest in mechanized farming, solar-powered irrigation, continental food corridors, and export-focused processing plants, one truth became undeniable. This time, Africa was not exporting its future, it was exporting its power.